Well, thank you very much, Carlos, for the invitation this evening. And thank you all for coming to listen to this lecture. Now, last week we heard from Tim Davies, and his lecture was fantastic. And it was absolutely full of evidence and facts and figures, most of which he generated from his years of research. Well, today's talk has got just about no evidence whatsoever in it. This is just a talk of tips and tricks which I've picked up over, well, 22 years of being a consultant now, looking after scaphoid fractures, some of them easy, some of them really quite difficult. And I just hope that by the end of this talk, each of you might have one or two ideas you take away that will make your life easier next time you come to treat one of these rather difficult bones. So I'll talk about these different aspects. We'll talk about the guide wire, how to get the guide wire in exactly the right spot. We'll talk about the choice and length of the screw. We'll talk about how we use K-wires to fix certain difficult fractures. I'll give you some hints about those tiny proximal pole fractures. We'll talk about humpback deformity, where the fracture just collapses down and how we can get that back open and fixed. And at the end, I'll just give you some ideas about the scaphoid plate and where there might be a role for certain fractures for that particular device. So let's look at guide wires. Now, when I first started, we didn't have guide wires. We had a screw that was solid, and we had to use a really quite awkward guide to try and get the screw into the middle of the scaphoid. But now we have wires and cannulated screws. It's an engineering triumph, in fact, the way they've designed them. But we need to get those guide wires just right. And I'll talk to you about how to get the screw down the middle, how to use another wire to stop the fracture rotating, how to stop a fatigue fracture, how important it is to make sure your wire's in the right position, with particular emphasis on the supinated and the pronated obliques. And then we'll talk about the dorsal approach and how we use the dorsal approach and a K-wire, which isn't actually quite so easy. So let's look at guide wire insertion. Now, I'd recommend you consider marking the skin. And here's what you do. You get a guide wire and you get the crosshairs of the image intensifier on the top left. And then on the top right, you can see when you get that guide wire exactly down the middle of the scaphoid. And then bottom right, you mark the skin with a marker. And this is so easy to do. What it means is that when you then try and triangulate your wire, one of those angles is completely taken care of. This will more than halve the time it takes to get your guide wire in the correct position. An easy tip. Now, you want to try and get that wire, that screw, down the center of the bone. And in fact, the trapezium gets in the way. And I tell you, it is okay to take a little bit of trapezium in order to get your wire and then the drill and then the screw down the middle of the scaphoid. And if you look at that picture on the right, you can see there's a little dent just in here, a little lighter shadow. And that's where I've just taken a bit of the corner of the trapezium. And it's okay to do that. You're taking a very, very small percentage of the surface area of that bone in order to get your screw right down the middle. Now, another thing is an anti-rotation wire. The scaphoid fracture, if it's completely transverse, is often very smooth. And when you put a lot of torque as you screw your screw in, particularly in young, hard bone, you don't want to displace that fracture in a torsional fashion. So an anti-rotation wire is not a bad idea. And often you'll get a wire that's almost perfect, but not quite. And all you need to do is to run another wire parallel. So that first wire, your practice wire, if you like, could be the wire you leave behind as an anti-rotation wire when you then go ahead and drill a second wire parallel to it. And we'll see later on when we talk about wedge fractures and a graft, where you can actually have a second wire, not just as anti-rotation, but actually to stop a graft from coming out. Now, I want you to think about fatigue fractures. A fatigue fracture of a wire can really spoil your day. You need to be very, very careful because these guide wires, by definition, are very thin. They have to be thin in order to go down the middle of the screw. But if they're thin, they're potentially quite weak. And when you have got your guide wire down and then you start to drill the bone, it's very easy with a big, heavy drill to just have a very slight angle and a bit of pressure. And as you push forwards, a bit of pressure, a bit of an angle, the wire gets hot and it can fracture. And if you fracture that wire shear with the distal surface of the scaphoid, it'll be very, very difficult to get that out, and it could really spoil your fixation. So be very, very careful. And I routinely, when I start to drill, get the drill as far as the distal cortex, and then I stop and I look with two different views and just make sure that that wire and that drill are absolutely lined up before I proceed. And if as you're drilling through, it starts to get a bit hard, doesn't want to move, again, just look and just make sure that that wire and that drill are properly lined up in two separate views. It can be a real problem if you forget that tip. Now, the other thing is that when you do your x-rays on the table, just as we all know that when you're examining a scaphoid x-rays in casualty, you have to do a whole load of different views, 4 or 5 views, this, that, and other views. So during surgery, you do need to make sure that you have got the proper views. And I personally put a lot of weight, a lot of trust in these two views, which are the 45-degree, if I get my hand on the screen there, a 45-degree supinated view and a 45-degree pronated view like this, and get those x-rays done. So pronated 45, supinated, and you can see them there at the bottom. And they are so important. And if you look at the bottom left there, you can see that you've got that 45-degree pronated view. And if you look at the scaphoid on that view, it looks like the perfect cashew nut. And that's the view where, if you can see that screw, you can see it's just about the right length. It could have been a millimeter longer, perhaps either way, but you can see it's in the middle of the scaphoid bone. And it's often on that view, if you don't do it, all the other views look just fine. And you do that view and you find, whoops, it's either too far anterior, cutting into the concavity of the scaphoid, or it's sticking out the back or sticking out the front, or it's too long. So I put a lot of weight in that particular view. And the one on the bottom right, the other 45-degree supinated view, you can see there with the screw right down the middle. And again, it's often on that view that you realize that your screw is nowhere near as middle as you thought it was. So those two views are really, be absolutely meticulous that you've got them and that you save them on your intraoperative image intensification. I have the pleasure, or not, of doing some negligence reporting from time to time. And sometimes you do see screws which are rather too long or rather in the wrong place. It's probably because these two views were not properly taken. Now, the other thing is when you do a proximal pole fracture, and I don't think if you're doing percutaneous fixation for these proximal pole fractures that you should do them in a closed method, because actually there's a whole load of tendons at the back here. And I think you really ought to be doing a mini open approach for these proximal pole fractures rather than a percutaneous approach. So proximal third fractures, you really need a dorsal approach. If you think about it, you can't see them that well from the front. And if you do, it's in a rather bald area of scaphoids. The proximal third's a much better approach from the back, but it ain't easy. And when you do the proximal third fractures, I find it very, very hard to get a guide wire. And I've been to some of Carlos's courses in Derby, and Carlos is brilliant. He's a much better surgeon than I'll ever be. But Carlos has got this great idea of you bend the wrist forwards and you're looking down the axis of the scaphoid and get this concentric thing. And there's a real knack, I think, I still find it difficult, sticking a guide wire through the proximal pole and getting it actually concentric down. But to actually look down the barrel of the scaphoid and try and turn the scaphoid into as concentric a ring as you can, like that. So you've got your guide wire down the middle. And another trick is you can actually take the guide wire out the far end. So you take it out distally, and then you're able to actually get your, actually then do your x-rays. Because otherwise, with you fully flexed forward with a wire hanging out the back, it's really difficult to get your x-ray views. So you can actually keep pushing it through and have it coming out here just to get those views. Not easy, I don't think, fixing guide wires through the proximal third from the back. The entry point, as it happens, is much more within the scapholunate ligament than you think it is. So that proximal pole wire, when you put it in, this is all scapholunate ligament here. And that wire is very much just at the edge of the scapholunate ligament. You should be just scratching the edge of that ligament if you want to get that wire and then the screw in the right spot. So there's a few tips for you about wires. Tips to try and get them in the right spot, to make sure they're not too long, too short, and to save radiation. I thought the next thing I'll talk to you about will be the choice and the length of the scaphoid screw. So let's have a look at this. Now, we all know what pi r squared means. And pi r squared, in my opinion, is very important in the scaphoid. So I've seen in the past, I've read textbooks, I've read papers, I've had people show me how to put the biggest, fattest screw you can possibly stuff down the scaphoid. Because if you do that, it makes the bone more stable. All right. Or you can get more compression because you're using a much bigger, stronger screw. Well, let me tell you, you don't need compression to get a scaphoid to heal. We know that. You can just fix a scaphoid with wires and it will heal as long as it's stable. What you need is stability. And here's something else. These tiny little skinny screws, if you look at them mechanically, you're never, ever going to break one of those in a scaphoid. And they get such good bite, particularly if you get, as I show you in a minute, much longer fixation. You don't want a big fat screw. Why? Because pi r squared means that for every slightly bigger screw you put in, you are hugely diminishing the biology, the surface area of bone in a bone that's already struggling to heal. What the hell do you want to do to obliterate your biology with a piece of metal? So use the thinnest screw that you can, but also try and use the longest screw that you can in order to get stability. So let me show you that. So stability is more important than strength. You'll never break those thin titanium screws. Stability is more important than compression. Scaphoids were healed with wires. There's no clinical or biological or mechanical evidence or empirical evidence or research evidence to show you actually need compression to get a scaphoid to heal. And actually, if you think about it, compression can spoil fixation. If you have a wedge-shaped graft, as I'll come to later, and you put too much compression in, that graft will just squidge and collapse and even extrude out the front. Pressure necrosis, these are very, very mechanically competent screws, and you can keep screwing until Christmas and you will get a huge amount of compression. And do we really know how much compression you should do before you actually cause pressure necrosis at the two adjacent edges of the bone? And the other thing is that if you put these screws in and keep going, what you thought was a screw that's the correct length, by the time you've finished, because you keep going, keep compressing, can poke out the other side. And with these wedge-shaped screws, if you take them out and then you put a smaller screw in, if you're not careful, they don't hold anymore, because you started off with a wedge that was like that, and you put a screw in that's too big, and then when you take it out and put a thinner screw in, that thinner screw is going to rattle in the gap because you're now putting a smaller screw in a bigger cone. So be careful about compression. Use thinner but longer screws. For me, I always use the micro, the smallest screw, whenever I can. You don't need graft for early fractures, either acute or early non-unions. And what you want is biology. So micro screw, pi r squared, will give you as much biology as you could possibly have, unless you use wires, where there's even more. And it also seems to me, and I've had occasion to do this from time to time, that in fact, quite a lot, if a first fixation doesn't heal with a small screw, perhaps there was no graft and it's percutated for some reason, it doesn't heal and it doesn't unite. If you use a small screw, you still have the option of going back another day in the future, taking out your small screw. You can put in bone graft second time round, and then use a bigger screw, because the bigger screw, the next size up, will still be able to bite the bone that's left behind, despite the first screw not getting you to heal. So to me, that seems to make sense, to use the thinnest possible screw you can first time around. There's another thing about screws. Don't use a short screw. So there's a proximal pole fracture, or for that matter, a distal fracture. But there's a proximal pole fracture with a short screw. And if you think about it, that long scaphoid bone wants to flex distally. We all know that the scaphoid wants to flex distally. You rupture your scaphoid ligament, the distal pole will flex forwards. Okay, you get a scaphoid waist fracture in particular, it will want to flex forwards. That's what it does. So if you have a short screw, there's the option, there's the risk that over time, as the scaphoid wants to flex forward, because that's what it does, you're going to distract and lose potential fixation. And also, if you use a short screw, you haven't actually got much in the way of fixation with these rather flimsy threads right in the middle of what's actually quite soft, spongy cancellous bone. So it seems to me that actually you should be using the longest possible screw. And in fact, if you get it just right, what you want to do is have bi-cortical grip. So here you are, proximal pole, there's a bit of cartilage, so that's still well buried at that point. And as long as you can, to see if you can't pick up distal cortex as well. Now, if you do that, you have a extremely rigid, stable fixation. Now, another trick with screws is when you have these very, very small proximal fifth, proximal sixth fractures. And with these fractures here, you've got to be very careful about putting a screw in it, even a micro type screw. By the time you put a micro head into this, again, pi r squared, you ain't got no bone left because you've taken up with the conical proximal edge of your screw. That doesn't really make sense to me if you want to get these proximal poles to heal. And this is a trick here using it's just an AO compact hand screw. In fact, my colleague David Hargreaves told me about this a long time ago, and it absolutely makes sense. So here I've just used an AO compact hand screw. It's a very narrow screw, and I'm consuming as little possible of that proximal pole bone stock as I possibly can by using that screw. And if you also look, and there you are, there's my, as I told you before, my pronated oblique view. See? It's bi-cortical grip going right up the middle of that cashew nut, and I've got grip either side. And this is the same patient, and here's a CT on the bottom right, and you can see that with just that fixation and a plaster, this guy healed. Rigid fixation, pi r squared, preserving your biology. Now, let's look at K-wires, not in terms of guide wires now, but in terms of wires being used to fix scaphoids. Now, this is the Euro handbook, which Gray and Gersel edited back in Hungary in 2017, evidence-based data in hand surgery. It's the Fesch book. And if you do a meta-analysis or systematic review, or whatever that is, you can see there that actually, whether you use vascularized graft or not, and whether you use screws or K-wires or not, doesn't actually seem to make any difference in the right-hand column as to union rate. So in fact, if you look at the top there, you can see that union instance with screws in 33 papers, 90%. Union rate with K-wires, 92%. Now, of course, all these meta-analyses aren't actually as good as they sound because there's selection bias, and easy fractures might have wires and difficult ones might have screws, who knows? Same with the bone graft story. So there's not much evidence that vascularized bone graft actually makes much of a difference compared with non-vascularized bone graft. And there's not much difference as to whether you use wires and a vascularized graft or wires and non-vascularized, or makes much difference. So I think the thing here is biology and stability. So it's okay to use wires. But if you use wires, remember this, you have to have a strong bi-cortical grip. So if you're using wires, and you need to make sure that you actually pick up both sides. And you need to have, of course, minimal effacing of the available bone. So the advantage of wires are, I think, that firstly, you're keeping your bone behind, your pi r squared behind. But secondly, and I think this is probably the reason, is that you have to do a bi-cortical grip. And you might imagine, perhaps, that 2 or 3 tiny K-wires with bi-cortical grip is a better fix than a compression screw, whether you compress it or not, where all of the screw, if not at least one half of it, is entirely within cancellous, soft, non-grippy bone. So in terms of stability, I think it might be reasonable to say that you're getting better stability with wires often than a screw, unless you get your screw so perfect you're picking up both cortices. So do think about that. Now, here's another idea for wires. So this person's had quite a big screw. That's a standard screw, and it hasn't healed. And you can see that screw's been rattling around. You've now got a big, big hole left behind. And you'll think, oh God, what screw? Well, I put a screw, another big fat screw. Well, for heaven's sake, do not put another even bigger screw in that thing, because that thing hasn't healed for two reasons. Number one, stability. Well, it looks like a nice long bi-cortical screw. But number two, the biology hasn't worked. So what you mustn't do is excavate another bit of biology by putting an even bigger screw in it. So change your mindset and think, no. And there are two ways to fix that. One is wires and bone graft. The other, as I'll come to at the very end, is a plate where you just turn your fixation paradigm to 90 degrees and fix it from the side. So big hole from the screw, a big hole from the non-union, and there you go. All right. So you've got three wires, nice thin wires. You consume no biology. It's absolutely stable. You've picked up two cortices. And in fact, I've put an extra one into the lunate as well to make it as even more stable as you can. And here we are. And this healed at 10 weeks. And that was a fracture that would normally be a very difficult fracture to heal. No vascularized graft, no nothing, just biology and stability. That's it. So there's some things. Now, what about these tiny proximal pole fractures? Here's one, tiny, tiny, tiny thing. What on earth do you do with these? Well, you could take the proximal pole out, but you do worry about the scapholunate ligament being entirely incompetent if you do that. And so there's something to be said for at least trying to get stability and some sort of fibrous union or stability there. Now, as far as the non-union proximal poles are concerned, people keep doing MR scans. I'm not quite sure why. We do have to use our NHS resource in a sensitive way. And really, we don't know what AVN means in the first place. I've never quite understand why, if there's no blood supply, all that calcium turns up to make the proximal pole go white in color. Calcium had to come from somewhere. But anyway, you're going to have to fix this anyway. So I'm not sure an MR makes any difference at all in terms of outcome. We don't even think that vascularized grafting makes much of a difference. And furthermore, if you're doing these difficult non-unions, a CT scan's a much better bet because it shows you exactly how big your bone is. It shows you the bone architecture. So don't bother with MRs. So these very, very small proximal poles, what can you do to try and make the biology as stable as you possibly can? We talked about not wasting pi r squared, not wasting bone, but things you can do. Now, one thing is, bottom left, you put in a very thin screw, AO compact hand screw I showed you earlier, and at the same time, to make it as stable as you can, put a scaphocapitate wire in, because that screw is pretty small, and a scaphocapitate wire completely locks the scaphoid into the mid-carpus. So I think there's no harm in putting a scaphocapitate wire in to try and get it to heal. The other things I showed you a bit earlier you could do is to put wires which go across the fracture, then pick up something else, either the lunate or the radius, to really try and lock that into a stable configuration. Now, here's one. This guy was a proximal pole fracture, and he really worried me. It was a tiny, tiny, tiny fracture. It's like the proximal seventh or something, and he was a fireman, and he had to heal this. I mean, no one's going to be a fireman with a proximal carpectomy or a four-corner fusion or something. So he had belt and braces, no vascularized graft, but a long AO compact hand screw, and I totally locked the proximal carpal row with wires, and we also stuck some extrusion in for good measure. And there he is, wires out and healed. And I was so pleased, not as pleased as he was. He was back as a fireman after about 4 months. It took ages to heal, but it did heal. And he's back working as a fireman. So there you go, stability and biology. The humpback deformity. Now, there's something. So whereas the proximal poles never go into a humpback, they just sit there as little proximal pole fractures. But the waist fractures, with all that distal force, start to turn into a humpback deformity quite quickly sometimes. In fact, some of them are humpbacked, I think, right at the moment of acute injury, if you look at acutely displaced fractures. But over time, the fracture flexes forwards, as you can see on my x-ray on the right, and you start to lose bone mass, and the bone mass is lost at the front. And you can see that fracture wants to be jacked back open again. But if you jack it back open, there's going to be a wedge-shaped defect at the front of your fracture. And you have to put something in that. Iliac crest, although with some decent carpentry, you can get a nice wedge of distal radius, particularly in really good, strong young people's bone. You can take a wedge from here actually and save the hip from an assault. There's a couple of things really which I've found to be useful. Now, the first thing is you need to get a really good exposure of the scaphoid. A really good exposure of the scaphoid. Now, we are told that you shouldn't remove these anterior ligaments just here, because if you do, the wrist will fall off and become unstable, and the wrist will start to slide onwards because you've lost these constraints. But I think that it's okay just to elevate about 3 millimeters. So here's your capsulotomy going into the scaphoid up here. And I think it's absolutely fine to take about 3 millimeters either side of your capsulotomy, just 3 millimeters, to expose the scaphoid better. The front of the radius just here has got a labrum of cartilage when you look next time. It's a bit like the shoulder's got a labrum of cartilage up here, or the hip or something, and there's a labrum just up here in the radius. And that labrum here is made up of those ligaments and a cartilaginous labrum. And you can just lift back, not much. If you take too much, you will get ulnar slidia carpus. That's a very, very bad thing to do. But 2 or 3 millimeters only will give you a hugely bigger exposure of your scaphoid when you're trying to get that wedge graft just right. So be careful. Please don't overdo it a bit. The other thing is to use joysticks, because what you want to do is to joystick that scaphoid open again. It's closed up. So you put joysticks in, and here you can see I put 2 joysticks in, and then using on the bottom right a pair of retractors so you don't fry your fingers, and you just gently pull it apart. And on the top left, you can see the x-ray where, having jacked it open with those joysticks, you can actually see the wires have bent somewhat. In quite a long-term non-union, you need quite a lot of force to jack that thing open. Occasionally, I've put a wire into the lunate at the back to try and use the scapholunate ligament to help as well. You can see how those wires have bent. Now, here's a slide that I think I want you to just think about. Avoiding the graft extrusion. Now, originally, I used to use double pitch screws like that. There's a couple of things with double pitch screws, I think. Firstly, if you put a wedge-shaped graft into the front of your scaphoid to create your humpback, by the time you've drilled out, that graft has actually got nothing holding it. There's no thread in the middle of that double pitch screw. So there's nothing holding that graft. Secondly, with this or with any compression screw, there is an issue. So if you look at the tube of toothpaste there, as you put compression on your screw, look what happens to your toothpaste. So if you're not careful, as you compress your wedge graft with any type of screw, you can imagine that wedge will be squidged out again. So there's a couple of things which I think might be worth thinking about. Number one is use a screw that's going to pick up the graft itself. Number two, if needed, put a tiny little K-wire, 1.1 or something, in as well, obliquely perhaps even, so you've got something else holding that wedge graft so it doesn't fall out the front. And number three, and this is something that Nick Downing from Nottingham suggested, and it's a great idea, Nick, if you're listening. You won't learn anything from me, Nick. You're too good. Look at this. He said, when you put your wedge graft in, why not take a little bit more scaphoid off. So take a tiny little slither of a wedge of the scaphoid. So when you put your wedge graft in, it's not so much of a wedge, it's more of a, a cubic structure. And I think that's a great idea as well. So the wedge is squared off a bit. So there's some hints about, I wish that toothpaste would stop. There's a hint about how to stop your graft extruding. And there you are again, using distal radius to stop invading your hip. Really important these days when we're using auxiliary blocks and we're trying to avoid hospital admissions and all the rest of it. But there you go. And you can see I've used a tiny little, it's 9mm or 0.9mm or 1mm wire to actually hold that little wedge in as well to keep it stable. And you can see even there, with the eye of criticism, the lunate is still slightly tilted backwards. So I couldn't quite get that correction full. And you can see how small the screw is, micro screw biology. We're sort of coming to the end now, as you can see from here. And I just thought I'd mention something about plates. I haven't done many plates, and they are technically really difficult to do. So do not underestimate how difficult it is to put these plates on. They are not easy. But Medartis make this 1.5mm screwed plate. And the idea is you put that plate into the scaphoid. You may also have a supplementary wire if you look there. And these are locking plates, and of course they're very strong, and you have to mold them to fit the gap. And you can see there's a paper here that's quite useful, it's quite recent, going through tips and tricks for scaphoid plating. I thoroughly recommend you read that paper before you go anywhere near the scaphoid plate. But they do have a particular role. So one role is that image on the top right, where you've had an enormous screw put in that bone. There's certainly no room for any more screws. There's a large transverse gap. And the paradigm here is that you just put the plate in at 90 degrees. And suddenly you've got a huge amount of space. You can curette out the hole where the screw was and fill that with graft. And you can also put a proper piece of bone in the non-union space and then fix it with a plate, which is biomechanically sound and it's rotationally stable as well. And pi r squared, yet again, you are thinking all the time about the biology of getting this fracture to heal. So that's one thing to think about. And there's the schematic diagram of how you've turned your fixation through 90 degrees. Remember, you don't need compression. You just need stability. A couple of papers from the American Journal last year where they used this for AVN using a plate. They all healed. And also with just autologous graft in the middle, just cancellous bone, and the device seemed to be stable enough. And I'll just draw your attention, if I may, to the bottom left picture, and you can see how the plate's actually relatively small, and you do have to put the screws in at quite a splayed out angle to pick up the poles of the scaphoid bone. And you may need to take off one of the splines. You can see one little screw spline's holes have been taken off here. And you may need to remove the plate sooner or later, because if you look here in the middle picture, if you flex forwards, you may find the plate impinges when you flex forwards. So I've almost finished my lecture, you'll be pleased to hear. So we talked about guide wire insertion. We talked about drawing a line to save you having to do too many x-rays, line on the skin. We talked about it being okay to invade the trapezium. We talked about using an anti-rotation wire, and if you put one wire that's almost perfect, you could just keep that and then put a perfect one next to it. We talked about proximal pole fixations, where it's difficult, but with practice you can do it, but it's not easy. We talked about the choice of screw, pi r squared, preserve the biology. You don't need compression, you need stability, and you need to preserve bone mass. So what you want is a thin but long screw. We talked about using wires to fix the fractures, that tiny fine wires picking up both cortices is very stable, and there's plenty of bone biology left behind. No evidence that they're inferior to screws. The tiny proximal pole, basically, I'm not sure you need a vascularized bone graft. In fact, I'm not sure how you actually get to fit into how you even reach the very, very proximal pole. I've never worked out myself how you'll get a Zeidenberg to come all the way across here to the proximal pole. But putting that aside, stability is the key. Real stability, and preserve the biology. So don't take out any more bone than you need to, or fill it with a screw that you don't need to. The humpback, they start to collapse down with some fractures straight away. You can wedge them open, use joysticks, try to avoid extrusion by just squaring off the native scaphoid so that the graft is less wedged, have a threaded screw way across, avoid compression, just hold it rigidly. A second fine wire just to hold it is not a bad idea. And we talked about plates as a new concept to try and fix these things orthogonally, fix them at 90 degrees where you used to think about fixing them, as a way of getting out of tricky, difficult situations. I'm not sure I'd use them for the standard fixation. I think there's this issue of cost and impingement, but certainly the difficult ones, they do offer a new approach. So Carlos, thank you very much.